Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one, we start out with the Russians have actually managed to cross the canal in the Chasiv direction, gaining a foothold in the eastern outskirts of the city itself, past the micro-district area and past the canal into the main part of the city. The Russians have captured numerous Ukrainian fortifications along the canal in this assault and have gained a foothold in the residential area. The main passing through happened from the Canal micro-district and the northern flank along the forest area, where the main push is going through the railways going through from the eastern bank to the western bank of the canal and along the forest areas. So we see heavy fighting taking place in the eastern parts of Chasiv following heavy bombardment of the city for the past months. And we see that the Russians with this crossing now have a foothold on the western bank of the canal inside the city itself. So with this development, we see that the Russians have initiated the next phase of the battle near Chasiv. This happens at the same time as heavy fighting continues in the Toretsk directions as the Russians develop their offensive operations towards Konstantinivka, both from the east and the northeast. And at the same time, we also see the continuous advances by the Russians in the south, along the Pokrovsk section of the front line, where here we see that the Russians are not just developing in the direction of Pokrovsk, but also the highway that goes between the city of Pokrovsk with Konstantinivka. So we're seeing developments towards the city of Konstantinivka from three directions, from the southeast, southwest, and northeast in the Chasiv direction. And this is where the Russians have crossed the canal, which is the biggest hurdle to the Russian offensive in the area. If the Russians manage to continue this development and expand their foothold to then start a general offensive through the city itself, it will significantly change the situation along this section of the front line. This crossing would put the Ukrainians in a panic if it manages to develop rapidly. We see that the current situation is that the Russians have gained a foothold, they have secured a foothold. So we'll have to see what happens next. Is this going to be a general offensive where they manage to advance at a rapid pace throughout the city to gain control of it? Or is it going to be more like Bakhmut, where the fighting is going to take many weeks before the Russians gain control over the city, or the Ukrainians establish a counterattack to push them out? In the Toretsk direction, we also see Russian advances here towards the second line of defense of the Ukrainians, but they've managed to align the front line here in the central parts in between the two hills of the Ukrainian defensive positions. And at the same time, they've managed to capture the rest of the forest area to the east of one of the hills, advancing through the residential area. So we see that the Russian push is now taking place along the northern parts and the southern parts towards both of the hills. And at the same time, they are trying to push through the central parts, aligning the front with the defensive line and potentially pushing through in the central parts, similar to what they have in the northern flank. Heavy fighting continues in the Toretsk section of the front line as Russians attempt to expand their zone of control, gain control of the Ukrainian fortified positions, and develop their offensive in this area to help the Russian positions in both of the other sections where heavy fighting is taking place. In the Avdiivka/Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced within the village of Vesele. Following the foothold they managed to gain yesterday, they are now pushing through to the central parts of Vesele and beyond. In the southern parts along Shelane, the Russians are attacking both of the Ukrainian fortified positions north of Shelane. This is an attempt to gain control of both of these fortified positions, which will allow the Russians to then push towards Shelane and the river line, the Ukrainian fortified positions along the Vovchansk river line. Capturing these two fortified positions north of Shelane would allow the Russians to move along the river line from the rear and combine that with an assault directly head on, which will allow the Russians to pincer the Ukrainian fortified positions, push onwards and gain control over them. This side with at the same time seeing a push from Umansky towards the Vovchansk river line from the south, and with the full capture of Novoslavka Persia, the Russians are also near the river line to the north. And we see that heavy fighting continues in this section of the front line with the continuous advances of the Russians day after day. In the direction of Vodiane, in between Volodar and Konstantinivka, the Russians have made another advance. This one was geolocated with this footage here. And we see that the Russians in this section of the front line are pushing along the entirety of it towards the road in between the two towns. We see here in central part with the recent push are within just 1.5 kilometers of the road. At the same time, we see continuous pushes along the entirety of the front line, where the closest parts are here just east of Vovchansk and now also along Konstantinivka and the area in between the two. We are going to see continuous Russian advances across, likely along the forest lines, so it'll look something like this in the following weeks, as the Russians are going to continue pushing, and then they will see a assault towards the fortified position, which will cut off the road between Konstantinivka and Vuhledar, likely see a capture of Vodiane before moving down south towards Vuhledar and Konstantinivka from these positions to expand the zone of control and develop the offensive operations. So you see that this is going to be one of the main areas of fighting in this Donetsk section of the front line. We see that the Russians over the past few weeks have intensified their assaults here in the month of July across the entirety of the Donetsk section of the front line, which has been the main section of fighting. We've seen a few positional fights in the Vovchansk section of the front line. We've seen some developments in the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kharkiv section of the front line, but the by far main push of the Russians in this month and the previous month have been here in the Donetsk region. And this has been a development and offensive taking advantage of the Ukrainian forces being essentially spread across the front line. The Ukrainians continue their counterattacks in the Vovchansk direction of the front line, but have managed to capture a parking lot and a few houses here to the west of the fortified position of the Ukrainians in the citadel area in the central parts of northern parts of Vovchansk, where heavy fighting takes place, both in the north and here to the Ukrainians' position, where they are attempting to cut off the Russian positions here by the aggregate plant. According to the latest reports by Deep State Map, there was some footage of Ukrainians shelling Russian positions in the aggregate plant, showing a bit further advance by the Russians in the gray zone, where they are being hit by Ukrainian FPV drones and artillery. And in the south, the Russians still have their positions here across the Vovchansk River line, where there are continuous reports by Ukrainian sources continuously saying that the Russian grouping by the aggregate plant and the southern bank of the Vovchansk River line are cut off, are encircled, yet there is no evidence of such. And if they were, then they would have been over a month without any supplies, and that is clearly not reasonable. Therefore, it is clear that they are not encircled yet, as we see the Ukrainians continue to push to gain this encirclement, but have yet to do so far. The Russians are holding out as much as they can to prevent this encirclement from happening. At the same time, it is also reported that the Russians are receiving some small time support, whether it be in food or ammunition, through the delivery from drones. And at the same time, we see heavy striking of Ukrainian positions across the front. So we see that there's heavy fighting taking place to have this foothold in the aggregate plant remain. And the main reason for that is to prevent the Ukrainians from establishing a proper position in the northern bank of the Vovchansk River line. The Russian positions here cut off the connection between the western and eastern parts, preventing the Ukrainians from establishing proper positions here in the western parts. The Ukrainians do have a connection across in most of the northern parts of the Vovchansk River line, which has shown that it has been able to capably push the Russians back in the eastern parts due to this connection and large area of crossing. This is why the Russians want to prevent the Ukrainians from establishing a wider crossing within this town of Vovchansk to prevent them from improving their positions. And this is why the push comes here along the bridges area, and that the Russian positions along the aggregate plant is so significant because it cuts off two crossings for the Ukrainians that are significantly limited by the Russian presence in the area. The Ukrainians have done some positional fighting in the eastern parts, where at some point the Russians actually managed to recapture it, but then the Ukrainians have now yet again recaptured the position, and therefore we see continuous fighting here in the eastern parts of Vovchansk, where the Ukrainians continue to improve their positions in an attempt to cut off the Russian positions and supply lines here in the northeast of Vovchansk. However, that is very difficult for the Ukrainians to achieve because the Russians have established defensive positions and fortified areas in the high ground here to the north of Vovchansk, supporting the defensive line and allowing the Russians to properly defend against the Ukrainian offensive operations here within Vovchansk, where they are attempting with their counterattacks to regain full control over the town. It is becoming more and more difficult the further they go onwards, as the Russians have prepared more and more defensive positions in the northern flank of the Vovcha river line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.